let's start our third panel. It's a very brilliant and interesting conference. We are going to start the third panel, focusing in particular on democracy and regional integration. And I would like to say two words at the beginning of the panel, and then present the distinguished paper giver and the discussants. Well, I'm Mario Telò. I'm a professor at LUISS currently, and I used to be for 25 years professor in Brussels University and the president of the Institute of European Studies. Why I mention that? Because of the fact that I would like to bring you a set of information, which are the results, the insight of 15 years of research on regional cooperation in the world, including in Latin America. We started in the framework of European Union-funded programs. Maybe someone is familiar in the room with Garnet, and then with the green programs. Green include Flaxo in Latin America. Garnet includes ITAM, Mexico. And we had a long dialogue also in the framework of the Forum Euro-Latino-Americano, starting in '92. We met several times in Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires University, and Uruguay, the Uruguay University, in the several capital of Latin America, in order to deepen precisely not only the relationship between European Union and Latin America, but also the interplay between the regional cooperation and interregional cooperation on the one hand, and the domestic process of democratization on the other hand. This was our focus. So there are a lot of people, I can inform you, it's a good news, that you have dozens of people working precisely on these topics. To what extent we have a kind of double interaction between bottom-up influence of domestic factors, endogenous factors, as Bjorn Etne says, endogenous factors, creating regional cooperation of new kind. He proposed the concept of new regionalism on the one hand, and on the other hand, the top-down influence of intergovernmental organization at global level, at interregional level, at regional level, on the domestic democracy. It's a kind of double interaction. So we started with the concept of external factors, as Morlino said in the morning. We started with the concept of new regionalism, emphasizing the importance of domestic factors in regional cooperation, social, business, political, cultural, and so on, cultural identity and so on. And then now we are shifting, and is the third book we are publishing in a few weeks, on the concept of competing regionalism. Competing, because we are witnessing, and I think Elena and Félix are particularly convergent on this research agenda, not on the particular thesis I will defend. Competing because we are witnessing a kind of multiplication of regional models, from pure FTAs, model NAFTA, all Circle and others, and to deeper regional organization where also, let me say, in political, cultural, social dimension are involved. And that I don't say only the second one matters in domestic agendas. Even the first one matters very much. Mexico is particularly influenced by the NAFTA, belonging to NAFTA. However, the influence of external factors is different according to the different regional models. This is the point. Does it matter also in terms of quality of democracy? This is a question I would like to address to the panel. Second point, we have a very long interplay with the theoretical issue. And Philip Schmitter was of big help 15 years ago, addressing the question on the one hand, on the, let me say, comparative influence of the external factors in domestic polities. Is the trivial idea that intergovernmental cooperation makes nothing else as strengthening executive power, empowering executive towards parliamentary side of democracy, or this is a little bit trivial? This is a very important question, because, concept of presidential regionalism and so on are, in my opinion, a little bit biased and should be deepened in a more profound way. For instance, in this room, we had a conference of interparliamentary cooperation in Latin America, the Parlasur and so on, and interparliamentary cooperation between Europe and Latin America, or networks. To what extent do social networks matter in terms of regional cooperation? Second question, is the inter-regional cooperation centered on the United States, FTAA, the ALCA in Castellano, different, is failed. It's different from with the inter-regional cooperation based on the European Union, the Rio de Janeiro process started in 1999, or it's different in terms of multidimensional or unidimensional, in terms of strengthening regional cooperation or not strengthening regional cooperation. This is also a very important element. Finally, I would like to mention that in my opinion, there is an interaction with the conceptual framework addressed by Morlino in the morning when he mentioned three criteria, let me say, criteria in terms of analyzing the quality of democracy. He mentioned the procedure, the contents, and the results, the satisfaction. Is particularly the results in terms of democracy affected by this regional, interregional, global dimension? How do regional and global interact? We have a master on these topics because he provided not only an excellent paper, thank you very much, but also a detailed analysis of the last week event, that is the agreement in Bali of the WTO. To what extent the interregional multilateralism between European Union and Mercosur is affected by the global one, and to what extent affects the domestic polity in terms of free trade, in terms of economic policy, and so on. Has this an impact on democracy? So they're particularly relevant. Well, I stop here, sorry. Big questions. We would be blind to ignore these questions. So thank you very much, Morlino and the organizers for hosting this, let me say, different but convergence research agenda. And I would like to start maybe giving the floor to Félix because he provided a particularly articulated paper. And then we have here the other panelists and then two discussants. Okay? Félix starts. I would say no more than 15 minutes. You
50?
Can? 15.
15. No, 50, you said.
1-5.
We began to negotiate. I would like to...
Félix is not only an old friend and partner in the Euro-Latin American Forum, but he's professor at the Febrero University in Buenos Aires. Please.
Thanks, Mario. Thanks for the invitation. I would like to make some reflections, but before I would like to say something about what Mario said. And he mentioned a fact, and that is important for our debate. And the fact that there is today some kind of competition of models about how to develop economic or political integration among countries. I had been this Monday in Santiago de Chile in a very good seminar about Alianza del Pacífico. And part of the discussion, there was a Brazilian friend also. We were invited to give our opinion about the Alianza del Pacífico. But one of the elements of this Alianza del Pacífico is that some people are presenting the Alianza del Pacífico as a competing model to Mercosur. In some way, they say it's a competition of Mexico with Brazil. Then in some way, they are presenting this as a confrontation of models. I don't think it is, but this explains why we are debating this subject in our region. And this other point that was raised by Mario is related with this debate. That is, what eventually could happen with democracy is if in our region, I want to be polite, I am talking only of our region. I'm not talking about Europe. Integration fails. Which is the option, which is the alternative for working together among neighboring countries? And I raise the point of neighboring countries, because one thing is the relationship between neighboring countries, another thing is the free trade agreement between countries that could be far, far away. Neighboring countries are those countries that, if we read the long history, could be eventually fighting among them. And to fight implies to have army and arms. And within weak political systems, to have army and arm very strong and to have reasons for fighting with a neighbor could be a serious risk for democracy. So I want to raise in my presentation 3 points. The first one is the relationship between democracy and integration. We discussed this morning the different way in which we could interpret the concept of democracy. The same thing happens with integration. There are many, many approaches to the word integration. And if you are with economists, they will tell you it's quite clear, is to have a free trade area, or particularly a custom union, or a common market, and there is a graduation, and step by step, etc., etc. Bella balasa. And then you see the reality and say, well, the reality doesn't tell you that this is what happens eventually among countries. And so I think that perhaps the best way to not to define integration, but when you are talking about integration in this context, to say what are you talking about, is to say integration from the political point of view, and this includes economic and social elements, is the quality of the neighborhood. The quality of the neighborhood expressed in the capacity of neighboring countries of working together in a permanent way, and if they are asymmetric in terms of relative power, in a win-win approach to the relationship between these countries. So, having in mind this concept, very large concept, if you want, of integration, I raised the question of which is the relationship with democracy. And I think we could approach this relationship, first of all, presenting democracy as a condition for working together. And this is very simple. Again, history helps. When within a country, neighboring countries, there is at least one country that thinks that could impose its will to the other country, they will not develop an integration process. Eventually, they will develop an army, and they will develop an hegemonic relation with a neighboring country. So in some way, integration implies that in each country there is a predominance of what we could call today, particularly today, the Mandela mandate. That is, working together with different people within a country. The articulation of people that thinks in a different way. And perhaps that is democracy. To have institutions that allow you to work together even if you disagree strongly with the way the other one thinks about the evolution of the country. That's the reason why I would mention Mandela in relation with his concept. And so in some way, this is a precondition for integration. Even if you put in a treaty, this, many treaties say that if you are not a democratic country, you cannot be part of an integration process. It's not necessary to say it. because if one country is not democratic, will break the agreement, even if there is a treaty, because it will be a country non-rule oriented, so it will not accept what the treaty says. The second approach would be the integration as a result, democracy as a result of integration, which is the impact of integration in strengthening democracy within the participating countries. And I think that in some way there are many elements that are the result of integration, but perhaps the most important elements, and here the experience of Europe is very, very interesting today particularly, demonstrate that these are elements, important elements, that is the development of a culture of negotiating, of making agreements, of making rule-oriented agreement, or accepting the opinion of the other one, but spending a lot of time discussing eventually. And in some way, this is something that is strengthened by another effect of economic integration that has a lot to do with the original concept of Jean Monnet, the les solidarités de fait. That is the development of a network of interaction in the economic field, particularly in the social field, the equivalent of Erasmus in Europe, in the social field, that makes people will not accept the idea of breaking what has been built till now. And so in a way, there is a process of retroalimentation, of integration and democracy, in which integration plays a role favorable to democracy. And finally, the third approach would be the role of democracy within the integration process. That is what in Europe you call the democratic deficit. If you want to have an integration process that could be sustainable in the long term, you need to have an integration process that represents the opinion of the people. And in some way, the people should be expressed in this integration process, because the integration process finally implies this distinction between we, us, we and us, you and we, nosotros y ellos. Sorry for my English. Nosotros y ellos. And if the people is not convinced that there is a distinction, you could have the problem that perhaps you have observed recently in Europe, or at least in some Europeans, or at least in some European countries, in which people, citizens, say their problem is not my problem. And in that moment, the idea of integration begins to fail. The problem with integration, we were discussing with Philip Schmitter recently, is that sometimes the expectations raised by integration are very, very high. This is the case of Mercosur in our region. And we should spend time, not today, trying to answer the question why these expectations are raised. I have an hypothesis, and the hypothesis is very simple. To raise expectation with respect to the long term doesn't have short-term costs. And in politics, everyone is concerned only with short term. So you can promise everything, and then you cannot fulfill the promise. I am beginning to write a small book that I will call it in Spanish. I don't know, didn't find yet a translation in English. I will not publish the book in English, but it will call La Curva del Desencanto. What explains the excitement of the first years and then the frustration of the people? And we have several examples in Latin America. Last Monday, when I spoke in Chile about Alianza al Pacífico, I recalled them the expectation about the Comunidad Andina, the Naciones. There was a Mexican friend in the meeting, I recall him, the expectations raised by CELA when it was established by Mexico and Venezuela. And we must make a critical analysis of the expectation we raised when we established Mercosur. So let me move now to the second point. I have 5 minutes only. The second point, that is, that has been developed in my paper, so I could mention only the point. That is the importance, to avoid la curva del desencanto, of the participation of people in all the levels of the decision-making process of an integration process. That means if each country adopts a strategy with respect to Mercosur, and this strategy is not consulted with the people, most probably what has been approved then will not penetrate reality, because there will be rejected by people or by sectors of the social, of the civil society. And we have several examples about this in the history of Mercosur. But it's also important the participation of civil society at the multinational level. In the case of Mercosur, it's not only the participation in Buenos Aires or at the national level in each province, in each city, but the participation of people in the Montevideo level, what some call supranational level, in the sense that if these decisions are adopted by ministers and particular sub-ministers without consulting people, eventually you will have problem, even if it is a multinational decision adopted by consensus by each participating countries. 50% or more of the decision approved in Mercosur had never been applied. And the third level is when the decision comes back to the reality, national reality, domestic reality, should be applied. And most part of the time is not applied. And not only they are not applied, but people do not use the legal instrument they could use to oblige the member states to apply these common rules. We have several examples in Mercosur very recently, in which every member of Mercosur says, for example, Argentina are applying restrictions that they should not apply. And the other day, one businessman asked his colleagues for other Mercosur countries, well, and why didn't you use never this dispute settlement mechanism of Mercosur? That means that perhaps these decisions are not contrary to rules. You don't use the mechanism. So this second level, the second point, the participation of civil society implies something very important, not only for Mercosur, that is transparency. The fact that you could obtain easily information about how decisions are adopted and which are the decisions that will be adopted. It's not only a problem in Mercosur, it's not only a problem in Europe. We had been discussing, they are discussing now in Singapore, the last WikiLeaks publication of the secret text of the TPP agreement, particularly about intellectual property. And what WikiLeaks say is that the main business firms related with trade among with Asian countries are very well informed of this text, but this text is not known by the public opinion. So this is something very important today, particularly when you could have everything in internet, everything in the web page, and this could help people to participate and to know about decisions before they had been adopted. And finally, and I finish, this relationship implies a continuous adaptation of what has been agreed to new realities. If things are moving continuously at the regional level, at the global level, you need to be continuously adapting your hoja de ruta, your roadmap of integration to the new realities. But at the same time, you need to preserve some kind of predictability in the rules. How to conciliate flexibility with predictability is one of the more important aspects to discuss in this relationship between integration and democracy in our two regions, not only in our own region. The continuous adaptation requires to accept something that is very, very, very difficult to be accepted by people that are in the academic field, that we, being economists, political scientists, lawyers, and that is that today there are no single model how to do things. Everything should be discussed. Everything should be mission discussion, and that there are no concepts that should be interpreted in a very dogmatic way. There is a very, very interesting book published in Spanish last week and published in English 2 or 3 months ago by Luc van Middelaar, The Passing of Europe. Very, very interesting because it's the approach to European integration from the point of view of someone that has been and is in el campo de batalla. He's a speechwriter of the President of the Council of the European Union. Well, I will finish my commentaries with this last remark. I think I didn't mention everything. Perhaps as a synthesis, you raised the subject of quality of democracy. Quality of democracy was raised this morning as one very, very important subject. I think that we should work the relationship between quality of democracy with quality of integration. And both are very, very important, and particular today in a world of region and inter-regional agreement, the relationship between the two processes are, in my opinion, very, very important. Well, that's, at least I spoke.
Wonderful. You really stick to the time. Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting. What I would like to summarize in one word is possible to connect the research on the quality of democracy and link it to the quality of integration. Yeah. And your approach is the diversity of regional cooperation and integration models. And you did show how it's possible to deepen regional integration and cooperation without an Eurocentric perspective. Oh, yeah. So taking into account Europe, but without a Eurocentric perspective. That is an achievement of the comparative regionalist studies in the last 10 years. So it was particularly focusing on regionalism. The panel is particularly good because we have a second presentation particularly focusing on inter-regions, that is the relationships between two different regions in particular, by Elena. And the third presentation by Feldmann, which is more focusing on a Panamericana, on the inter-American dynamics. So you have three different kinds of regional and inter-regional cooperation. Maybe Elena would like to bring her contribution now in 15 minutes, and then Feldmann, you agree? Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Mario, both for introducing this panel and for inviting me. And
Sorry, Elena is a professor at the Fundação Getúlio Vargas de Rio, and she's particularly relevant as a leading figure in international relations and comparative regional studies.
Hardly, but thank you for that. Hoping to be one day. Well, thank you again, even more now. And thank you very much to Leonardo as well. It's really a pleasure, but also extremely awe-provoking to participate in this conference for three reasons that I'm about to confess. First, that I was invited quite late on, so what I'm going to present is actually an attempt to update an older paper. Secondly, because I will try to link this paper to democracy, but it is not really written as a paper about democracy. I will explain how I will try to do this. I was very relieved to hear that Andreas's paper is not about regionalism, so between the two of us, we've missed one part of the panel each, so I think that will pretty much save us. And thirdly, because I'm not an expert on Latin America, I come from the field of European studies. I work in Brazil on this issue. Inevitably, that means I get invited to all Spanish-speaking events where I try to speak Spanish and talk about Latin America, which I will try to do now as well. This paper, what is it actually about? Well, it is about many things linked to what Félix talked about. It's linked about what model of regionalism are we seeing in Latin America, and more particularly, what model of regionalism is Brazil advocating, at least in rhetoric, if not in practice? I say rhetoric because the methodology used is qualitative discourse analysis, which means that the data in the paper is based mostly on discourse and rhetoric rather than on practice. That's one part of it. The other part of the paper, and basically the basic focus of it, is to understand what impact the crisis of the European model of integration has had in the rhetoric that Brazil has advocated. And again, I say rhetoric because many times there has been criticism when one talks about the EU model and its implementation in Latin America. Everyone says, oh, that's all nonsense. Actually, there is no EU model in Latin America, but there has been, and maybe not, but there has been an understanding, rhetorically at least, that that was the model to be promoted. So what I try to do in this paper is first talk a bit about what is the EU model actually? What is it that those who write about EU model, the EU's ability to export this model, what model is it that they're talking about, and how do they talk about this exportation, this diffusion of this model through the EU's interregional relations? And that's the part of interregionalism. The second part of the paper focuses on the discursive use of this model as a symbolical sort of tool to promote regional integration in Latin America, particularly in South America, in Brazilian foreign policy. And I look at that during the two periods of the Lula administration because there was a very focused interest in the region, albeit one that started earlier but started being seen more during the Lula time because of the particular objectives of foreign policy. So the second part looks at this discursive use of the EU model, focusing particularly on statements and speeches by Lula and his foreign minister, Celso Amorim, particularly again in the case of Mercosur and UNASUR, which were two of the key projects, regional projects that Brazil was not only involved in, but leading during those two periods. Thirdly, I look at the impact of the financial crisis in the EU on the deconstruction of this ideal model of regionalism that the European Union represented for Brazil, for the instrumental use of that model in its foreign policy. And here I define the EU's crisis not just as a financial crisis, but also as a crisis in solidarity, a crisis in democracy, a crisis in legitimacy, and also a crisis in equality, not only within the European states, but also between the European North and the European South. So in many ways, this crisis, as I perceive it, deconstructs various fundamentals of the European model. And finally, and this is the new edition, as I said, this is an old paper, I tried to analyze CELAC, in which Brazil is now getting more and more involved, as an alternative proposal of a model for regional integration, and to understand in what ways does CELAC depart from a lot of the assumptions about regionalism that were there pre-EU crisis, and how Brazil is advocating these assumptions. So these are kind of the four parts. I hope that democracy can figure in some kind of sort of I don't know, abstract way, and it obviously does figure because, let me just say before I start with the substantial matter, there is a democracy clause in Mercosur, there's a democracy clause in CELAC. To what extent these are satisfied is another story, but as I'll say in the end as well, there's two understandings of democracy that interplay in the region that I think are quite interesting. Now, to go to the substantial part of the paper is actually published in Contexto Internacional if anyone wants to read it, so just a point. What is the beginning of the paper? As I said, the European Union and the model of regionalism. Fundamentally, the academic literature on regionalism, as Philip and Mario and others here know, has been based to a large extent on the European model. So there is a departure from that more recently, but if one looks at the academic literature and what is regional,
Thank you very.
Say to Martha, our slogan, I think everybody who works on European affairs, how do you make Europe without Europeans? But you keep complaining there are no Latin Americans, there are no Europeans, there are few now. But when they started, there were probably even less Europeans than there are today Latin Americans.
That makes the comparison possible. That makes Adam.
I have a question to the panel, and it's supposed to be to enlighten what he said. I just want to know, what do you think is the importance of constitutional clauses that recognize superiority of treaties over national laws? I'm asking this question in part somewhat polemically as to cooperation and integration.
This is a very good point. No,
What's
there's a difference here. This is what the European...
Because the Argentine constitutional amendment.
No.
sorry, but what's the importance of?
Sorry, just.
International public law. Treaties are fine. Acta sunt servanda, okay. But only for the very specific items in the treaty. The genius of the European integration, the trick, of course this passed unnoticed at the time, was to declare European law superior regardless of what the treaty said. So they converted a treaty-based regional scheme into a quasi-constitutional scheme. And that's why they got away with murder until the 80s, because nobody paid attention to it, and it seemed advantageous. People that, there's more trade, there's more travel, all these nice things. So people let it happen. And then they found themselves trapped by this quasi-constitution that goes beyond the treaty. So it's not just the treaty is only for the specific items in the treaty. And if you can make a case that it's not in the treaty, completely ignore the treaty. That's all the constitution. But when you start transforming the treaty, then you get away with all kinds of...
But we know that this kind of legal construction is an ex-ante construction.
Yes.
An open construction towards the future. It says whatever treaty the government will enter into will overcome national laws. So this is extremely binding, it's extremely complex.
Yes, very well. Thank you for this very pluralist debate. Very pluralist debate. That means that it was a very good idea to bring these topics in the conference because we have scientific controversy. Where we have scientific controversy, there are food for research, for a future research agenda. I try to, before giving the floor to the three panelists, to summarize. I think, number one, we have a debate in the room, and even in the international literature regarding the trend of regional cooperation. I prefer regional cooperation as Philip in Latin America, and is certainly a situation of, according to someone, of a spaghetti ball, this one. According to others, is a kind of competition between 2 or 3 different models, as you said and others said. So there are not 1,000 models, there are 2 or 3. One is much more kind of a revival of NAFTA, a pure free trade, as you said, or trade. Another one is absolutely ideological, ALBA, against United States, this idea of Chavez. And number 3, we have the process Mercosur, UNASUR, which is a multidimensional. So at least we have three different paths. And no one is corresponding to the European Union. I agree with you and others. However, the European Union matters as reference, comparative analysis, not only underlying similarities. It's also very good to underline differences, since Max Weber. So I think this is the general frame. Second issue, what this competing regionalism context has to do with democracy and human rights. We have, this is the second big issue we discussed. Someone say not very much. Someone says, Félix and others say, has to do by at least 3 ways. Number 1 is a precondition, is an interplay between democratization and regional cooperation. On the other hand, there's impact. Regional cooperation is a kind of external factor in democratic consolidation, the problem you addressed. And number three, the question of democracy within the organization. Or someone said is a kind of laboratory for democracy in the international life, someone said. This kind of problem of kind of evolution, general evolution of multilateralism, because regionalism is an experience of small-scale multilateralism. It has multilateralism to do with democracy and human rights. This is a big question going beyond our discussion. And Bob Cohen says there is a global governance dilemma. We need more global governance and regional governance, but the more we have regional and global governance, the more there is demand, the call for democratic accountability and so on. So this dilemma is true for regionalism and for global organization. So number three, the third question, which was addressed, I'm very happy for that, is the theoretical implication. Philip addressed the question in discussion with Leonardo. You addressed the question in a very brilliant way. So the question is a double one. Number one, the question of sovereignty, the unit. What about the evolution of the unit? What about the democratic model, Republican or not Republican, for instance? Number two, the question of the approaches, methodological approaches to region. Are we happy with rational choice, neo-institutionalism? It's just matter of interest? Someone mentioned interest. It's just matter of interest, national interest, instrumentalizing regional, or is also matter of perceptions, ideas, mutual recognition between states and nations, friendship, or the opposite of this. So, in my opinion, we are not happy with pure rational choice in an institution in order to understand what is happening. This is the theoretical issue which has to be discussed. So I would like to give the floor maybe in the opposite order. Before you have the floor, the first, if you would like to give some feedback.
I would address Lauren's question. I try to be cautious and prudent in the sense of not overemphasizing the role of the inter-American system. I agree with many of the sort of claims you made that the actual experience of people on the ground are in many ways difficult and it doesn't, I mean, they have a hard time in a way grasping or seeing major changes in their life because of what the inter-American system does. The system has a lot of problems. I think it's slow, it's expensive, it's elitist, it's over bureaucratic, it's colonized by states, and I will elaborate on this. So by no means I want to picture a very rosy sort of image of the system. Nonetheless, I do think that, I mean, if you run a counterfactual, probably without the system, the situation would be much worse. You were raising the issue of Guantanamo. The Commission has had hearings on Guantanamo. It has tried to apply pressure on the United States. So is the problem the Commission, or is it rather the recalcitrance of the U.S. government? I would say it's the latter. And the second thing that is very important is that one of the problems that the system has is that since it is a political sort of construct, it's colonized by states. So in other words, the promotional work I was talking about is based on voluntary basis. So in other words, for instance, what country supports the freedom of expression rapporteurship? The United States. So Venezuela uses that very cleverly, saying, well, the funds you are getting are from the empire, so all what you are saying is basically contaminated. In some way that's true, but what the Commission is saying about freedom of expression in Venezuela is true. And besides, and because I did work in the Commission for many years, I do think that the work is technical. And it's not only referring to Venezuela, it's also referring to Peru, etc. The Mexicans do the same thing. The only rapporteurship they support very handsomely is the rapporteurship on migrant workers. So the Commission does a good technical work, but it's colonized by states, and that makes And that leads me to my third point. I think there are good and bad criticism against human rights. Some are good when you look at it and from a substantive point of view, you are criticizing it for being based on an individual basis. For instance, indigenous communities are against this notion of individual rights because they believe that rights are actually collective. And those are grounds to say, well, if you think that dignity can be accomplished either by individual, by, in a way, respecting the individual rights, or by whether respecting collective rights, if you conceive them in that way. I think that's a good criticism. But the criticism doesn't go against the notion or a basic notion of dignity. And so I think it's a fair criticism. But when you see some criticism, for instance, cultural relativism, when you say, women don't have the same rights as men because, that's our culture, that's a less serious type of argument. And I think in many ways, governments in the region and elsewhere criticize human rights with the wrong arguments. And that doesn't really weaken the doctrine as such. And I think one has to be careful about that. It's exactly what Venezuela does. We don't believe in, liberal democracy. We believe in popular democracy. So when you look at them, it actually, in certain ways, they are distorting the real substance of what democracy means, regardless of where we cannot agree what it is. We have a hard time, in a way, coming to a consensus, but we understand, for instance, what it isn't. And well, I could go on, but the whole 30 years of discussion, in a way, go in this way. And then, with regards to the notion of constitutional status, at least in principle, human rights treaties should have preeminence over domestic laws because otherwise they wouldn't work. Lawyers, unfortunately, and particularly judges, are very clever. So they distort the meaning of the treaty. And the notion is when a country ratifies a treaty, it commits itself to changing its domestic legislation in order to converge with. That doesn't happen, unfortunately. And then that's what Chile does. For instance. Chilean judges don't recognize, the superiority. They simply, that's a major flaw, because when the country ratifies a treaty, it's committing itself to doing that. Chilean judges don't do that. American judges don't do that. And that has to do with the domestic constitutional order. In the United States, treaties don't acquire immediately constitutional priority or constitutional status. The U.S. Constitution, and that international judges always make this fun, make comments on this. The U.S. judges are convinced that their laws are better than international human rights. So I think that there is certainly a problem, but it has not to do with the way in which human rights treaties were created. It's the way in which they are interpreted and applied, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. Elena?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to respond to a couple of comments that Detlef made and then address the general issue of comparative regionalism. First of all, I think I mentioned twice when I spoke and in the paper as well that this was an exercise in understanding the Brazilian discourse about regionalism, which is a very different thing from Brazilian practice, and I think I mentioned that. You asked, you said I should agree with you that Brazil doesn't support EU-style regionalism. In practice, yes. In rhetoric, no. I could read from the paper various things. There's a quote by Amorim that I just found here. He said, there must be an understanding that Mercosur is just like the European Union was many decades ago. We're trying to grow fast. We try to do 50 years in 5. So I think there is a very large discrepancy between discourse and practice, as I think I began by saying when I talked, and it's in the paper as well. Nevertheless, discourse and rhetoric is a foreign policy tool, and I think it's worth studying. So that's how I see this issue. And I don't think Brazil is doing EU-style regionalism, but I think up to a point it was using EU-style regionalism. Same thing about the question of a model. I always feel like saying model, the word model is like throwing a bomb somewhere, because everyone reacts. It's kind of got these colonialist, hegemonic sort of nuances to it. But obviously, as I said, Brazil is not using this model to create regional projects. But I would say that just for the mere history and circulation of ideas, one has to acknowledge the existence of a prototype. And the same way that I believe personally that the European Union used elements of the United Nations and League of Nations, the history of ideas, to create its institutions, I cannot accept, even though it's not PC, that there are not elements of the EU that we can find in the creation of various post-EU regional organizations, including institutional isomorphism. There is that, including the fact that things like flexibility clauses and variable geometries, they were done in Europe first. And the mere fact that if you talk to any of the architects of Mercosur or UNASUR, they are completely informed about how the EU works and what is done. So just for the mere belief in the circulation of ideas, I think we cannot completely discard some kind of interaction, as well as the fact that, that's something Mario said much earlier, there has been a lot of external influence in the creation of institutions in Latin America during the 90s, and the EU was one of the ones that was funding a lot, so we cannot just say this didn't happen. That too, obviously, exactly. Exactly. And Latin America needs money, or needed. So that's, I think, the critical part of what I was saying, and I'm sorry if it didn't come through. Same thing about what you said, Brazil prioritizes UNASUR over CELAC. Actually, in the paper, and I didn't have time to say this, what I say is actually Brazil is using, in its regional strategy, the same principle as its global strategy, which is autonomy through diversification. So you basically have one foot in every kind of little pool, and that kind of seems to work. Yes, that's what Félix likes to call it. And so that about that. About, now, just one comment on what you said about trust, and I think it's very much linked to the sovereignty question. There is a problem that sovereignty, in my opinion, in Europe, undergoes a severe transformation at the time of decolonization, basically, and at the time post-Second World War. And this experience leads to an acceptance of the fact that pooling sovereignty could work as a strategy. I think Latin America does not have this experience at that point. It has a very different, actually, post-colonial experience, beginning a bit further. And the centrality of territory and territorial integrity and sovereignty is such that trust requires other mechanisms to be built, I think, than what the Europeans needed. And this is exactly the problem of imitating, that you have a very different historical experience. So it should be other things that create trust.
I would like to make three commentaries here. The first one, Marta, friendship, trust. That is important if you are trying to build a new nation. But to my knowledge, anyone is trying to do this kind of thing in South America or Latin America. But not only is it important when you are trying to build a new nation, a supranational nation, it is important, could not be important even to have a nation, if you have a nation. I will give you a very good example. It's very difficult to say that among the Americans, through history, there has been always friendship and trust. Think of the black people with the white people. So it's not necessarily even a condition for a nation. It's less a condition for working together within a region. Second point, with respect to transparency. There is a small or big, I don't know, difference in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, there was no internet. So it was impossible for the people to demand information. Information was more difficult to obtain and to distribute. Today, we have one factor in Europe, in Latin America, and everywhere, that is the empowerment of people. And people will not accept anymore that diplomats could negotiate without giving information of what they are doing. For example, take the case of the agreements of the European Union with Colombia and Peru. It was initialed, and it was not published. It was published only 2 years after, because it had to be translated to 25 or 26 languages. Today, that would be impossible. You must publish anything you are negotiating, because people will require that kind of information. And the third commentary to my friend, Philip. This recalled me the argument I heard many times from our friends in America, United States, when you ask them, what is democracy? Obviously, democracy is what we have. But we have the same problem with Europeans. What is integration? What we did. I have been negotiator, and I have discussed with European negotiators, what are you implying for a South Mercosur integration? It was in the early steps of the bi-regional negotiation. And the answer was very simple. It's what we did. That was the period in which Europe could tell Latin Americans, take it or leave it. Yeah, things have changed now. I must say that it's very, very difficult to define what is really integration. What is integration for you or for many people is not integration for me. So we must explicit the concept, and not necessarily your concept, my concept should be the only concept with which we could work. I recall an anecdote with a very good friend in a meeting in Lisbon about European and Mercosur integration some years ago. In some moment, I make a comparison. I say something that implies to compare Mercosur and the European Union. And my friend told me, and I will tell you in Spanish because I don't know exactly how to translate it, and perhaps because he was from Spain, he told us, because there were several people, es un insulto a la inteligencia humana tratar de comparar Mercosur con la Unión Europea. That would be impossible today. And I think that in this kind of discussions we have to compare things, we should try to achieve some common denominators in the comparison exercise. And I think that we must work a lot about what really we imply for with the word integration, with the word democracy, with the word regionalism.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting speeches, panelists. Thank you very much for the intervention. I think maybe two things just to conclude. Number one, we didn't solve every problem. Sorry for that. However, we make some steps forward toward the common language. Some steps forward toward the common language. Even if it's, as you say, there are integration conference. But I can assure you, I was 10 days ago in Jakarta for a similar conference on ASEAN and the European Union. 10 members of ASEAN attended the conference. It's more difficult. Yeah. Because, you know, between the European and Latin America, we have a lot of commonalities in terms of culture, in terms of language, and so on, which don't exist in other parts of the world. So the preconditions are there for a deeper dialogue, and this is confirmed by our discussion of today. And number two, I would like to explain why some of the Europeans, in one word, are quite more optimistic about Latin America than you. Because we come on a regular basis since 30 years already, and we witness a tremendous change. And it's positive. It's a continent which is free from nuclear weapons, number one. And we were about to build up in Argentina and Brazil 30 years ago. So, and number two, the democratic consolidation. And number three, in spite of the crisis, they are as prosperous as never in the history. So this change and the pride of Latin Americans, the pride of Brazilians, the pride is absolutely new, as you remember. So this change for us as Europeans are tremendously impressive. That's why we are a little bit more optimistic about Latin America sometimes than you are. Well, I have to conclude two good news. Good news number one.
We conclude.
We concluded we have a meeting at 8 o'clock, Hotel Félix. Still. Yes, Hotel Félix, 8 o'clock. Even better. We will convene again tomorrow at 9 o'clock to start the final part of the conference. 9 o'clock.